Under the 1930 London Treaty, the U.S. was allowed to build several superdestroyers, ostensibly to act as squadron leaders. The Navy never really liked the idea, as it leads to a vessel that had different tactical characteristics than the ships it leads. Still, other navies were building such vessels, so the U.S. was forced to respond in kind. The result was the 8 ships of the 1,850-ton Porter class. These ships were essentially larger versions of the Farragut's. As it turns out, this was too much of a good thing. To justify the increased weight and match foreign types, it was necessary to increase the number of guns by 50%, from 5 to 8. Yet to remain within the weight restrictions, it was impossible to make these guns dual purpose. The result was 8 heavily gunned destroyers whose guns couldn't be used against the omnipresent threat of aircraft. Originally, 4 were to be built, but the order was doubled. Porter, Selfridge, McDougal, and Winslow were all started December 18, 1933. Porter was finished August 27, 1936. Selfridge was finished November 25, 1936. McDougal was finished December 5, 1936. Winslow was finished February 17, 1937. Phelps was started January 2, 1934, and finished February 26, 1936. Clark was started January 2, 1934, and finished February 26, 1936. Moffett was started January 2, 1934, and finished August 28, 1936. Balk was started May 16, 1934, and finished March 24, 1936. Radar, sonar, and medium anti-aircraft, along with light anti-aircraft, was upgraded during the war. Those that survived 1942 had an extensive overhaul of their main armament. As stated, main armament was originally 8 5-inch 38 caliber guns in 4 twin turrets, 2 forward and 2 aft. Unfortunately, these mounts only had a maximum elevation of 35 degrees, and as such were incapable of engaging enemy aircraft. Like the Farragut's, they carried 2 center-line quadruple 21-inch torpedo tubes, one in front and one behind the second stack. Finally, they carried 2 depth charge racks and throwers at the stern. Propulsion was 4 boilers venting through 2 stacks, generating 50,000 horsepower to 2 shafts, driving them up to 35 knots. Porter was escorting the carrier Lexington when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. She spent the rest of 1941 and the first 3 quarters of 1942 alternating between Hawaiian waters and the West Coast. In mid-October 1942, she sailed with Enterprise and took part in the Battle of Santa Cruz. During the battle, on October 26, 1942, she stopped to rescue the crew of a ditched Avenger torpedo plane. Unfortunately, while doing so, the sinking plane's torpedo went live and hit her. Damaged beyond repair, she was abandoned and scuttled. Selfridge was at Pearl Harbor when Japan attacked. She spent the rest of the year and the first 5 months of 1942 escorting convoys in the carrier Saratoga. In late May 1942, she sailed to the Southwest Pacific and operated with a joint American-Australian force, which eventually covered the Guadalcanal invasion before moving west to cover the fighting around New Guinea. At the October 6, 1943 overnight battle of Vella Lavelle, she was hit by a torpedo that blew her bow forward of the bridge off. Repairs would keep her out of the war until mid-May 1944. Returning to the fleet, she escorted carriers and provided fire support until late August 1944 when she was transferred to the Atlantic. She spent the rest of the war there and was decommissioned October 15, 1945. McDougal spent the entire war in the Central and South Atlantic, occasionally sweeping around to the Southeast Pacific. She was decommissioned March 8, 1949. Winslow also spent the entire war in the Atlantic. She was decommissioned June 28, 1915. Phelps was at Pearl Harbor when Japan attacked. Quickly joining Lexington, she took part in the battles of the Coral Sea, Midway, and the invasion of Guadalcanal, before heading to the West Coast in mid-October for overhaul and training. In early 1943, she headed the Aleutians and operated there through the end of the third quarter of 1943. Returning to the fleet in October 1943, she provided fire support and escorted the carriers until mid-July 1944. She joined the Atlantic Fleet in mid-August 1944 and remained there until the end of the war. She was decommissioned November 6, 1945. Clark was at San Diego on December 7, 1941. She spent the rest of 1941 and January of 1942 escorting convoys between Hawaii and Samoa. In February and March of 1942, she took part in the carrier raids in the Southwest Pacific before returning to escorting convoys and support ships in the Southwest and then Southeast Pacific. In September 1944, she transferred to the Atlantic and spent the rest of the war there. She was decommissioned October 23, 1945. Moffett spent the entire war in the Atlantic. She was decommissioned November 2, 1945. Balk was with the carrier Enterprise when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. She continued to cover Enterprise during the early 1942 carrier raids, the Doolittle Raid, the Battle of Midway, the Guadalcanal invasion, and the Battle of Eastern Solomons. In early 1943, she transferred to the Aleutians and operated there through the third quarter of 1943. In October 1943, she returned to the Southwest Pacific and provided fire support for the Third Fleet as it liberated the rest of New Guinea and the islands south of the Philippines. In mid-July 1944, she transferred to the Atlantic and spent the rest of the war there. She was decommissioned October 19, 1945.